this is where actually, well, Bekky is going to join, and we'll get to just kind of expand a bit and chat into some of those elements, and, you know, before we explore any more practical ways. So Bekky, welcome back to the space. How are you feeling?
Oh, it feels like vulnerability in action now, doesn't it?
I know. But I'm pleased that you're leaning in. I know it's when I was talking to Michael about this, more just like, this is probably, not one of the easiest. And then even imagining, someone coming into the space to share about their experiences, again, quite brave. So really grateful for you doing that with us today. So first question I wanted to ask, and this is the usual style that we kick things off. Just if you tell us a bit about yourself, your story, the trailer version. Well, reflecting on your experience as a queer person, have you struggled with aspects of your identity in the past?
Yeah, I think I would say I've always felt like the odd one out from childhood up until now. I still feel often like the odd person out in the room, even if I'm surrounded by sort of like-minded individuals. I'm queer, I'm non-binary, I strongly suspect I'm neurodivergent, vegan, I can't even go for lunch with people and connect over similar lunches sometimes, so I've definitely always felt like a bit of an odd one out in the room. And I think when you're younger, you don't necessarily have the language or the experience to be able to really express or explore that. And as a consequence, it can feel quite isolating and it can feel quite lonely in that space. And I think with that comes a lot of shame, to your point of being the person in the playground that doesn't necessarily know how to fit in, how to communicate and how to make friends even, and I think that's really difficult. So I've definitely had those issues in the past. And I think there's been a lot of learning to do around unpacking almost the judgments I've held against myself for not being able to have the conversations and the language that I do now in these spaces.
Yeah, we said a lot there, Bekky. And I just noticed we had someone raise their hands. We'll have time for that afterwards, but really appreciate you if you want to drop something in the chat as we go along. But picking back up on what you said, Bekky, you touched on, loneliness, shame, and that kind of that journey of learning, not having the language, having to almost learn on your own through experience, and then now how this has informed your own processes. And earlier on, we touched on, how building compassion is also can potentially be informed by, relationships, dynamics. And I wanted to kind of reflect on this with you. When you kind of think back on that journey for you, like what were the most important relationships in your life at the time, and how did they inform, your experience of kind of giving and receiving compassion?
Well, I think my family are quite similar to me. We don't naturally necessarily engage well with emotion, and we don't naturally necessarily know how to handle it always. So I think it was growing up, it felt like I was trying to figure out this puzzle. The world was a gigantic puzzle, and I didn't necessarily have the cheat codes that other people might have had, because they maybe had people that could help them experience things differently or do things in a different way. And I think it was my first job really, where I was working with a colleague and they just commented on the amount of times I'd apologized in one sentence. And it was like, you're almost just apologizing for existing at the moment. And I think that was a real turning point for me, because it was a notice that actually it was almost like this verbal tick. I hadn't necessarily noticed that I was almost constantly apologetic just for existing. And off the back of that, I did a course in London with a group of queer people, sort of based in NLP and neurolinguistic programming, around how to use some tools to explore what internally your stories were about yourself, and how you handled those differently or better. And I think that was the first time I really learned to take ownership over my mind. I'd entered that weekend almost talking to myself, looking back like a TV sergeant major, like just get on and do it, like no one cares, like you're worthless. And it was a realization during that weekend that you can treat yourself with self-compassion and still do the hard things, or you can treat yourself horribly and you do the hard things, and which one feels better, right? Like the nice one feels better, like how you would treat your best friend feels better. So that was a real turning point for me, and being able to have that community of people to lean on and unpack some of those things and be vulnerable in front of, and that be safe, that be okay, was huge, was absolutely huge, so having that network was really important for me, and we still catch up now, sort of 14 years later, just to have that accountability and take ownership over what we can do for ourselves. So that's been a big part of it.
Mm, that's I love it when you get to do. Sorry about my cockerel. When you get to to explore and to kind of dive deeper, but feeling surrounded by others as well who are willing to do this work. And you kind of touched on elements of my next question, Bekky, as you talked about your journey of affirming yourself and stepping more into yourself and making that decision. What feels better? Well, can I still use self-compassion and actually move forward and do the things that I set out to do, essentially. And I wanted to just touch on a key piece there, because doing this work often requires a level of vulnerability. And I'm wondering, how did you kind of navigate that, and moving forward then, how did you see that being just playing a bigger role in your life as you created that change for yourself?
So I think initially I probably navigated it poorly. It can be quite a change, going from being quite guarded and not sharing things about yourself for fear of judgment or disconnection, etc. So I think initially it was a journey to get to being more open and like walking alongside that vulnerability side. But I think it's been everything for me, like the vulnerability, the self-compassion. I think for me, I had quite a brittle, almost a brittle notion of who I was as a person. And in order for that to still exist, I had to tick certain boxes, or I had to do certain things. And I think the self-compassion to go, well, maybe I'm worth that. Maybe I'm worth it regardless of what I do. People are valuable. They're worth it regardless of whether they are able to achieve certain things or say certain things, and that's okay. And that was a real turning point as well, I think. So that, alongside with the vulnerability of really opening up to people, because unless you open up to people, some people are quite reluctant to open up to you, and that's fair enough, right? We can't expect people to do that if we're not willing to put ourselves in the arena as well. So for me, a big part of trust is the experience of being vulnerable, and that working out okay with someone. You can't necessarily trust someone if you're not willing to be vulnerable. And just having those experiences to be able to connect with people in a way that I hadn't necessarily understood how to previously was a huge turning point. I guess kind of ironic that I had to learn and to connect with myself before I could connect with other people, but I guess we've all got to start somewhere. So
Totally agree with you there. I'm wondering, in terms, if we're kind of like shifting gears now, because this is a lot of self-work, but if we're looking at these practices and how they translate in your role, in your role as a queer leader, because you and I have had previous conversations about, just queer leadership, but I'm wondering, how does this kind of play out? If you could give us just some examples of how you use this in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the quickest way to build connection with people is to share vulnerability with them. I mean, it's got to be appropriate. You can't just, start crying in a meeting and that build connection. But I think when you're working in a place and you're trying to understand where people are coming from, why they want a change for a certain area or why they're giving certain feedback, often in order to be able to understand why it's so important to them, you have to know why it matters. And why it matters is usually a personal thing, and to share that is quite a vulnerable experience, I think, for people. And it makes it even more powerful on the receiving end to hear why it matters to people, this seemingly otherwise potentially mundane or box ticking request. You suddenly understand it a bit more. And I think I've had an example where I've been on the asking end, and potentially the receiving end. So we had a session where we were sort of exploring what connections and networks we had within a business that I worked in, and every group was represented apart from LGBTQ plus, and there was no mention of it, and it was quite apparent to me that their absence, and I knew they existed within the workplace because I connected in with them before. And I think the opportunity to ask a question on where they were and why they were missing came up, but it was you had to get the question upvoted by people, so other people had to also want to ask that question, and people weren't voting for that question, which was disappointing from my point of view, but also sort of maybe indicative about why it wasn't mentioned at the start. So I messaged some colleagues and said, appreciate you're not on this call, but can you jump on and can you upvote this question so it gets asked? And the vulnerability to go, I haven't got time to explain this to you now, but I need you to trust me, knowing me that it's important that this gets asked. And people doing that was incredibly powerful, and it wouldn't have happened if they hadn't have gone along with that. So question was asked, and people were on holiday, and that was it. Just glossed over, and you go, that's okay. You know, people are doing the best they can with what they've got, right? We're all in this together. And they obviously didn't understand why it was so important that I wanted that question asked. So I thought, what can I do now? So I emailed the director of HR, and I said, this is why I'm disappointed by what happened today. You know, this is why it mattered to be, and what can I do to support us doing that differently? And by being vulnerable and opening up and explaining it, it becomes a common problem that you then share. You know, I'm willing to be vulnerable and I'm willing to step into this space. Are you willing to meet me here? And then how do we take this forward? And it becomes less confrontational and more a shared problem that you then work together on. And I think that's been really powerful for me.
That's so powerful, because I think it speaks back to what you were mentioning earlier, you know, about that ownership piece of self-compassion, and also, you know, recognizing that if my needs are worth it, worth exploring, worth sharing, and taking that step to move forward. That was great. Thank you for really framing that, Bekky. It was really, really good example. Last question as well, I wanted to kind of share, because again, you know, we'll touch on this in the next part, but it takes some cultivating as a practice, you know, compassion, and how we know that it's also linked with, you know, self-care and really keeping our tank full in order to be open to receiving and to giving. So I'm wondering, in your case, you know, what are some of the most essential kind of self-care tools that help you kind of bolster, you know, your ability for compassion, and are boundaries anywhere in there as well?
Yeah, so permission for me is huge. Permission to do whatever you need to support yourself, even if that looks odd or weird to other people. You know, I quite often used to eat my lunch in my car because it would be the only space I would get a bit of headspace from people. And that's okay, you know, understanding that it's okay and giving yourself permission to do things that might look a bit odd or weird to other people. Outside of work, meditation really helps me, like giving me that space and giving me that time to think about something differently and just reflect on things. I'm a big fan of workplace rituals as well sometimes. So the one that I tend to use is making a coffee. So if you've got 2 minutes, 5 minutes in between meetings, physically going and making a coffee and having that space to just give yourself time to reground yourself and know that regardless of what difficult thing you're doing, you will make this coffee again tomorrow. You will make it the day after. You know, things move on. You might make it somewhere else. It might taste different, but you'll make it. So that's been really important for me. And boundaries are huge. You know, absolutely huge for me. I'm a huge introvert, and people don't believe me when I tell them. They think I'm an extrovert and I'm fibbing to them. So I need to be really clear about my boundaries. It's not that I don't want to spend lunch with you. It's not that I don't want to connect with you outside of work, but I need this time to myself just to restore. You know, my wife always says, you can't pour from an empty cup. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that. And she's big around making sure that we take time. You know, I take my time to make sure that I can give everything my all when I have conversations. And we don't always have to do it either. You know, if you haven't got the capacity right now, it's okay to hold that boundary and go, do you know what? I'm not going to step into this fight right now because I haven't got the energy to. And that's okay. It's not all on us to take the steps all the time. So it's permission, and trust yourself to do the right thing for you.
Thank you so much, Bekky. You literally delivered the next piece for me. But
I'm so sorry.
no, I love it. And I think that's essentially, so it's always, you know, better when someone's actively practicing it and really sharing, you know, what that is for them. And I love how you really framed it, you know, about the rituals as well, the company ritual. I love that. This is something we did touch on when we did a self-care and well-being webinar, but I just love how all of that fits into your understanding of self-compassion as well. So thank you, Bekky. Please stay with us. I'm sure we'll have questions at the end as well.